One man looked at a human heart and thought, we can upgrade this. Michael DeBakey didn't grow up dreaming of fame, fortune, or becoming a medical celebrity. He grew up with something far more dangerous, curiosity mixed with zero tolerance for mediocrity. The kind of personality that looks at a working system and says, yeah, but why is it working this badly? Born in 1908 to Lebanese immigrant parents in Louisiana, DeBakey entered the world at a time when medicine was, let's call it, confident guessing. Doctors wore white coats, spoke in serious tones, and hoped for the best. Surgery, in particular, was less of a precise science and more of a high-stakes gamble where the house always had a slight edge. Most people would have looked at that and thought, well, that's just how things are. DeBakey looked at it and thought, that's unacceptable. Even as a young student, he had a reputation for being intense, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the quiet, relentless kind of way that makes people slightly uncomfortable. While others memorized facts to pass exams, DeBakey wanted to understand why things worked, and more importantly, why they failed. Because failure, in medicine, wasn't theoretical. It wasn't a bad grade or an awkward presentation. It was a person who didn't walk out of the hospital. And that reality hit him early. While studying at Tulane University, DeBakey wasn't content just attending lectures and reading textbooks. That was the bare minimum. Instead, he spent hours in labs, observing procedures, asking questions that most students wouldn't dare to ask, not because they were dumb, but because they were too uncomfortable. Why does this patient die? Why can't we fix this vessel? Why do we accept this outcome? These are not the questions that make you popular. These are the questions that make professors pause, sigh, and realize they're dealing with someone who isn't going to settle. And then came the moment that set the tone for his entire career. While still a medical student, not a seasoned doctor, not a renowned surgeon, just a student, DeBakey developed a device that would change surgery forever: the roller pump. Now, that might sound like something you'd scroll past on a medical website, but this was a big deal. Before this, managing blood flow during surgery was complicated, to put it politely. Surgeons were limited in what they could do because they couldn't reliably control circulation. DeBakey looked at that limitation and essentially said, what if we just fix that? So he designed a pump that could move blood through tubes without damaging it. A simple idea. Simple in the same way that what if we could fly was a simple idea before airplanes existed. The roller pump later became a critical component in the heart-lung machine, the device that allows surgeons to operate on a still, open heart while the machine keeps the patient alive. Let's pause there for a second. A student created something that would make open-heart surgery possible. Most people at that age are trying to figure out how to pass finals without crying. DeBakey was casually laying the groundwork for modern cardiac surgery. And here's the part that really defines him. He didn't treat this as some genius breakthrough moment. There was no dramatic celebration, no "I've changed the world" speech. For him, it was just the logical next step. Something didn't work, so he fixed it. That mindset, brutally simple, almost annoyingly practical, would follow him for the rest of his life. But the world he was about to enter wasn't ready for someone like that. Medicine at the time had a certain culture, hierarchical, traditional, respectful of authority. You didn't question the system too much because the system was built by people who had been doing this for decades. And then comes DeBakey essentially saying, respectfully, you're doing it wrong. Not loudly, not arrogantly, just consistently. That's what made him dangerous. Because he didn't need to prove he was right with words. He did it with results. And results are very hard to argue with. Still, being right doesn't always make you welcome. As DeBakey moved forward in his training, he developed a reputation. Brilliant, yes, but also demanding, uncompromising, and, depending on who you asked, difficult, which is often just a polite way of saying, this person refuses to lower their standards so the rest of us can feel comfortable. He expected precision, he expected effort, and most of all, he expected medicine to be better than it was, because in his mind, good enough wasn't neutral. It was dangerous. Every shortcut, every outdated method, every "this is how we've always done it," those weren't traditions. They were risks, risks that someone else would pay for. And DeBakey wasn't interested in preserving traditions if they came at that cost. He was interested in progress, Relentless, uncomfortable, sometimes inconvenient progress. The kind that forces everyone else to either step up or step aside. And as history would soon show, stepping aside wasn't really an option. Because Michael DeBakey wasn't just going to participate in medicine, he was about to completely rewrite what surgery could be. If part 1 was about Michael DeBakey refusing to accept how medicine worked, part 2 is where the world forced him to prove what better actually looked like, because nothing accelerates innovation quite like war deciding your timeline for you. And as World War II erupted, medicine was suddenly no longer about slow improvement or polite academic debates. It became brutally simple: fix the problem fast or people die faster. DeBakey, now fully stepping into the medical world, didn't just observe this chaos from a distance, he walked directly into it. And what he saw wasn't heroic battlefield drama. It was logistical disaster disguised as effort. Wounded soldiers being transported inefficiently, treated inconsistently, and often dying not because their injuries were unsurvivable, but because the system around them was outdated, fragmented, and painfully slow. And once again, most people accepted this as the unfortunate cost of war. But DeBakey didn't believe in unfortunate. He believed in fixable, which is a very inconvenient belief to have when everyone else is busy surviving the current system instead of redesigning it. He began analyzing not just individual treatments, but the entire structure of military medicine, from the battlefield to the hospital. And what he noticed was almost absurd. There was no standardized, efficient method to move injured soldiers quickly to places where they could actually be saved. It was like having firefighters, but no plan for getting them to the fire. And so DeBakey, instead of waiting for permission or consensus, started proposing something radically simple and therefore apparently revolutionary: organized mobile medical units that could move closer to the front lines and stabilize patients before it was too late. This idea would eventually evolve into what we now recognize as Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals, or MASH units. But at the time, it sounded like yet another one of DeBakey's "why aren't we doing this already?" suggestions that quietly implied everyone else had been okay with inefficiency for far too long. And as usual, pushing this idea wasn't smooth, because institutions, especially during wartime, don't love being told they're doing things wrong by someone who refuses to soften the message. But DeBakey had something more persuasive than rank or tradition. He had logic backed by results, and gradually, the system began to shift. Not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Suddenly, wounded soldiers were receiving care faster, survival rates began to improve, and what once seemed like chaotic damage control started resembling an actual system designed to save lives rather than just respond to loss. And here's where things get interesting, because while most people would look at this achievement and think, "That's enough, you've done your part," DeBakey saw it as proof of something much bigger, that medicine didn't have to be reactive. It could be engineered, optimized, redesigned like any other system. And once you realize that, you can't unsee it. Which meant he wasn't just solving wartime problems, he was building a blueprint for how modern medicine should operate everywhere. During this period, he also worked extensively on improving surgical techniques for vascular injuries, which in war were incredibly common and incredibly deadly, because damage to blood vessels often meant rapid death, and traditional methods weren't good enough to handle the scale or severity of these injuries. But again, not good enough was basically DeBakey's favorite challenge. So he began refining techniques to repair blood vessels rather than simply tying them off, which had often led to amputations or worse. And this shift, from accepting loss to actively preserving function, was subtle in concept but massive in impact, because it changed the goal of surgery from "stop the bleeding" to "restore the system." And that difference is the kind that rewrites entire fields. But here's the part that really defines this phase of his life. He wasn't working in ideal conditions. There were no perfectly equipped labs, no calm environments for careful experimentation. This was wartime, chaotic, resource-limited, and unpredictable, which means every improvement had to work not just in theory, but under pressure, immediately, consistently, and with no room for error. And somehow, that environment didn't slow him down, it sharpened him. Because for someone like DeBakey, constraints weren't obstacles, they were design parameters. By the end of the war, the impact of his work wasn't just visible, it was undeniable. Systems had improved, techniques had advanced, and survival rates had shifted in ways that couldn't be ignored. And yet, if you expected a moment where DeBakey paused, looked around and thought, "We did it," you would be misunderstanding him completely, because for him, this wasn't the finish line. It was proof that the old limits of medicine weren't real. They were just unchallenged. And once you remove that illusion, everything changes. The war had shown him something most people never fully grasp. That progress doesn't come from comfort. It comes from pressure, from situations where failure is too expensive to tolerate. And that lesson would follow him into the next phase of his career, where instead of battlefields, he would be facing something arguably even more complex. The human heart itself, not as a mysterious, untouchable organ, but as a system that could be understood, repaired, and, if necessary, redesigned, which at the time sounded less like medicine and more like science fiction. But then again, so did the idea of operating on a still heart before someone actually figured out how to do it. And if there's one thing Michael DeBakey had already made very clear, it's that the difference between impossible and obvious is usually just one person refusing to accept the current version of reality. By the time the war ended, most people in medicine were exhausted, satisfied just to return to something resembling normal life. But Michael DeBakey wasn't interested in normal because normal, in his experience, was just another word for "we stopped improving." And after seeing what rapid, forced innovation could accomplish under pressure, he returned to civilian medicine with a mindset that was almost unsettling. If we could redesign systems during war, why were we suddenly okay with limitations in peace? And nowhere was this question more dangerous than in the field of cardiovascular surgery, because at that time, the heart was still treated with a kind of cautious reverence, almost like a forbidden zone where surgeons approached carefully, did as little as possible, and left quickly, because the risks were enormous, and the tools were, let's just say, not exactly designed for precision work inside the body's most critical system. But DeBakey didn't see the heart as sacred. He saw it as mechanical, a pump, a network of vessels, a system with inputs and outputs. And once you start thinking like that, the entire conversation changes, because machines can be studied, improved, repaired, and if necessary, replaced, which sounds obvious now, but at the time bordered on heresy in surgical circles. And naturally, this is exactly where DeBakey decided to focus his energy. He began developing new techniques for repairing blood vessels, particularly the aorta, the largest and arguably most important artery in the body. And here's the problem he faced. When sections of major blood vessels were damaged or diseased, there was no reliable way to replace them. Surgeons were essentially working with a system that had no spare parts, and that's not ideal when the system is keeping someone alive. So DeBakey did what he always did. He looked at the limitation and asked why it existed, and more importantly, how to remove it, which led to one of his most influential innovations, the development of synthetic vascular grafts. Now, imagine telling someone in the 1940s or 50s that you're going to replace part of a human artery with a man-made material and expect the body to just accept it and continue functioning. That's not a pitch, that's a science fiction plot. But DeBakey wasn't pitching, he was building. And in one of those stories that sounds almost too symbolic to be real, he reportedly used his wife's sewing machine to help create early versions of these grafts. Because when you're trying to reinvent surgery, you don't always wait for perfect equipment, you use whatever works. And what he created fundamentally changed what surgeons could attempt. Because now, instead of working around damaged vessels, they could remove and replace them, turning previously fatal conditions into treatable problems. And once again, the pattern repeated. Skepticism, resistance, gradual acceptance, and then eventual recognition that this wasn't just an improvement, it was a shift in what was considered possible. But DeBakey didn't stop at grafts, because of course he didn't. That would have been too reasonable. Instead, he continued pushing into increasingly complex territory, performing some of the earliest successful surgeries on aneurysms, conditions where blood vessels weaken and bulge, essentially becoming ticking time bombs inside the body. And prior to these techniques, many of these cases were simply monitored until they became fatal, because intervention was too risky. But DeBakey's approach flipped that logic. If the outcome of doing nothing is death, then too risky becomes a relative term. And with improved techniques and tools, those risks could be managed, reduced, and eventually accepted as part of a new standard. And here's where his personality becomes impossible to ignore, because this level of innovation doesn't happen politely. It doesn't happen by asking for consensus and waiting for approval. It happens because someone is willing to push forward despite resistance. And DeBakey was exactly that kind of person. Demanding, precise, and, depending on who you ask, exhausting to work with. Because he didn't just expect excellence, he enforced it. Every detail mattered. Every step had to be correct, and there was very little patience for anything less, which made him both incredibly effective and, at times, incredibly difficult. But results have a way of justifying intensity, and his results were impossible to ignore. As his work gained recognition, he became a central figure in the emerging field of cardiovascular surgery, helping to establish it not as a risky niche, but as a legitimate, evolving discipline, one that could tackle conditions previously considered untouchable. And in doing so, he helped shift the perception of what surgeons could and should attempt. Because once you successfully repair something as critical as the aorta, the question is no longer, should we try? It becomes, what else can we fix? And that question would drive the next wave of innovation, not just for DeBakey, but for the entire field. But progress at this level doesn't happen in isolation. And as DeBakey continued to push boundaries, he found himself in an environment where other brilliant, equally driven individuals were working towards similar goals, sometimes as collaborators, sometimes as competitors, and occasionally as both at the same time, which set the stage for one of the most fascinating aspects of medical history: the race to master the heart, not just repair it, but control it, stop it, and bring it back, safely, consistently, and predictably. And if that sounds like something that should come with a warning label, it absolutely did. Because the next challenge wasn't just about replacing vessels or improving techniques, it was about redefining the limits of life support itself. And as the field moved closer to making open-heart surgery a practical reality, the stakes increased dramatically. Because now, the question wasn't just whether you could fix a problem, it was whether you could temporarily take over the body's most essential functions and return them without consequence, which is the kind of problem that either leads to historic breakthroughs or very public failures. And knowing DeBakey, he wasn't particularly interested in the second option. By the time cardiovascular surgery began evolving from bold experimentation into something resembling controlled precision, Michael DeBakey found himself standing at the edge of a question that sounded less like medicine and more like a dare. What if you could stop the human heart and still keep the person alive? Because up until that point, surgeons were essentially working against a ticking clock, every procedure limited by how long the heart could continue beating while they attempted repairs, which meant speed was everything and precision was often sacrificed in the process. But DeBakey had already proven that limitations in medicine were usually just temporary design flaws, and now the flaw was obvious. You couldn't properly fix the heart while it was still moving and responsible for circulation. So the logical, slightly terrifying solution was to separate those two functions, to create a system where the body could survive without the heart actively doing its job, at least temporarily. And this is where things started to feel less like surgery and more like engineering on the edge of science fiction, because the idea required something extraordinary. A machine that could take over the role of both the heart and the lungs, maintaining circulation and oxygenation while surgeons worked on a motionless, open heart. And while the foundational concept had been hinted at before, including by DeBakey's own earlier work with the roller pump, turning that idea into a reliable, repeatable reality was an entirely different challenge, because now you weren't just assisting the body, you were replacing its most essential system in real time, and the margin for error wasn't small, it was non-existent. During this period, DeBakey became deeply involved in refining techniques, tools, and approaches that would make open-heart surgery not just possible, but practical. And that distinction matters, because possible in early medicine often meant it worked once under very specific conditions, while practical meant it could be done consistently, safely, and with predictable outcomes. And achieving that required an almost obsessive level of detail. Every component of the process had to be understood, controlled, and optimized, from blood flow dynamics to oxygen levels to the physical handling of tissues that were never meant to be exposed in this way. And as expected, this level of ambition didn't come without tension, because DeBakey wasn't the only one pushing toward this goal. Other pioneers in the field were racing towards similar breakthroughs, each with their own methods, philosophies, and egos, and in an environment where the stakes were literally life and death. Disagreements weren't just academic, they were personal, professional, and sometimes explosive. DeBakey's approach remained consistent with everything he had done before: methodical, precise, and relentlessly focused on improving outcomes, but also uncompromising, which meant collaborations could quickly turn into rivalries when standards didn't align. And yet, despite the friction, progress accelerated, because competition in this context wasn't about winning recognition. It was about solving problems faster than the problems could claim more lives. As techniques improved and machines became more reliable, the once unthinkable began to happen. Surgeons could stop the heart, operate with clarity and control, and then restart it, bringing patients back from procedures that would have been impossible just years earlier. And if that sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, that's because at the time it essentially was. Except instead of special effects, it required flawless execution because there were no second takes in an operating room. DeBakey played a critical role in pushing these advancements forward, not just through direct innovation, but through setting standards, training other surgeons, and building systems that could support this new level of complexity. Because breakthroughs don't change the world if they stay isolated. They have to be taught, replicated, and scaled. And that's where his influence became even more significant. He wasn't just performing surgeries, he was shaping an entire generation of surgeons who would carry these techniques forward, expanding their reach and refining them further. But with increased capability came increased expectations, because once you prove that something can be done, people stop accepting excuses for why it isn't. And suddenly, conditions that were once considered untreatable became cases that demanded action, which placed enormous pressure on surgeons to perform at a level that had no historical precedent. And in that environment, DeBakey's intensity became both an asset and a challenge, because while it drove excellence, it also created an atmosphere where there was very little room for error or hesitation, and not everyone thrived under that kind of pressure. Still, the results spoke for themselves. Survival rates improved, procedures became more refined, and the field of cardiac surgery transformed from a high-risk gamble into a disciplined, evolving science. And at the center of that transformation was a mindset that refused to accept boundaries simply because they had always been there. But perhaps the most profound shift during this period wasn't technical, it was philosophical. Because for the first time, surgeons weren't just reacting to disease, they were actively redesigning how the body could be supported, repaired, and sustained. And that shift opened the door to possibilities that went far beyond what anyone had originally imagined. Because if you could temporarily replace the function of the heart and lungs, what else could you replicate, augment, or improve? And that question would lead directly into the next phase of DeBakey's work, where the line between medicine and technology would blur even further. And the idea of supporting life wouldn't just involve fixing what was broken, but creating entirely new ways to keep the human body functioning when its natural systems began to fail. Which, as it turns out, is exactly the kind of challenge that someone like Michael DeBakey had been preparing for his entire life, whether he realized it or not. By this point, most surgeons would have been satisfied with what had already been achieved: the ability to operate on the heart, repair major vessels, and perform procedures that had once sounded impossible. But Michael DeBakey was not wired for satisfaction, because satisfaction implies a finish line. And in his mind, medicine didn't have one. It only had the next limitation waiting to be dismantled. And as cardiac surgery continued to evolve, a new, far more uncomfortable reality began to emerge. Even with all these advancements, there were still patients whose hearts were simply too damaged to repair. Cases where surgery wasn't about fixing a problem, but about confronting the fact that the system itself was failing beyond recovery. And traditionally, that was where medicine stopped, where the conversation shifted from intervention to acceptance. But DeBakey had spent his entire career rejecting that exact mindset. So naturally, instead of asking, "How do we accept this?" he asked a much more disruptive question. What if we don't need the heart to work at all, at least not on its own? And just like that, the focus shifted from repair to replacement, from supporting the body to actively substituting its most essential functions, which is the kind of idea that makes even experienced surgeons pause, because now you're not just treating disease, you're redefining what it means to keep someone alive. This is where DeBakey's work with mechanical circulatory support devices began to take shape, particularly the development of early ventricular assist devices, machines designed to help the heart pump blood when it could no longer do so effectively. And if that sounds like something pulled from a futuristic lab, that's because at the time it essentially was, except there was no futuristic technology waiting to be used. Everything had to be built, tested, and refined from scratch, often under intense pressure and with limited precedent. And once again, DeBakey approached the problem the same way he always had: break it down into its simplest components, understand the mechanics, and then design a solution that could operate reliably within the complexity of the human body. The challenge, of course, was enormous, because the heart isn't just a pump, it's a dynamic, responsive system that adjusts constantly based on the body's needs, and trying to replicate even a fraction of that function with mechanical devices required a level of precision and understanding that pushed the boundaries of both medicine and engineering. But DeBakey wasn't working alone. By this stage in his career, he had built teams, trained specialists, and helped create an environment where interdisciplinary collaboration became not just beneficial, but necessary, bringing together surgeons, engineers, researchers, and technicians to tackle problems that no single field could solve in isolation. And slowly, through trial, error, and relentless refinement, these devices began to move from theoretical concepts to practical tools, capable of sustaining patients who would have otherwise had no options left. And while early versions were far from perfect, bulky, complex, and not without risks, they represented something fundamentally new, a shift from medicine as a reactive discipline to medicine as a system of continuous support, where failure didn't have to be immediate or final, it could be managed, delayed, and in some cases overcome entirely. But with this new capability came new questions, not just technical, but ethical, because once you can extend life using machines, you also have to decide how far that extension should go, under what conditions, and for whom. And while DeBakey was primarily focused on making these advancements possible, the broader implications of his work began to ripple through the medical community, forcing doctors, patients, and policymakers to confront scenarios that had never existed before, situations where survival was no longer binary, but dependent on systems that could sustain life in ways that blurred the line between natural and artificial. And yet, for all the complexity and controversy, the impact was undeniable. Patients who would have been considered beyond help were now being given time. Time for recovery, time for further treatment, or at the very least, time that previously didn't exist. And in medicine, time is often the most valuable resource of all. Throughout this period, DeBakey's role continued to expand beyond the operating room, influencing not just surgical techniques, but the entire structure of modern healthcare, from education and training to hospital systems and research initiatives. Because he understood that innovation doesn't happen in isolation, it requires infrastructure, support, and a constant flow of new ideas and skilled professionals. And so he worked to build that ecosystem, ensuring that the advancements being made wouldn't remain limited to a few institutions, but could spread, evolve, and become part of standard practice. But perhaps the most defining aspect of this stage of his career was not just what he created, but how he thought. Because at a time when many would have seen the limits of the human body as fixed, he treated them as variables, parameters that could be adjusted, supported, or even bypassed entirely. And that mindset, equal parts visionary and relentless, is what allowed him to push medicine into territory that once seemed unreachable. Still, progress at this level is never without resistance, and as mechanical support systems became more prominent, debates intensified, skepticism remained, and not everyone was ready to embrace a future where machines played such a direct role in sustaining life. But if there's one pattern that had defined DeBakey's entire career, it's that resistance rarely stopped him. It only delayed the inevitable, because results, once again, were on his side. And as more patients survived, more procedures succeeded, and more systems improved, the question shifted from, should we be doing this, to how do we do this better? And that shift set the stage for the final phase of his story, where the focus would move from innovation to legacy, from breaking boundaries to redefining what those boundaries even meant, and where the true scale of his impact, not just on individual lives, but on the entire field of medicine, would finally come into full view. By the time Michael DeBakey reached the later stages of his career, most people would have already been turned into history books, their work summarized, simplified, and quietly placed into the past. But DeBakey had no interest in becoming a chapter. He was still actively writing the story, still operating, still teaching, still pushing medicine forward with the same intensity that had defined him decades earlier. And what made this phase of his life almost surreal was not just the longevity of his career, but the fact that he was now working in a world that had been fundamentally shaped by his own ideas, a world where procedures that once sounded impossible were now routine, where devices he helped pioneer had evolved into standard tools, and where entire generations of surgeons had been trained in systems he helped build. And yet, despite all of this, he didn't slow down, because in his mind, progress wasn't something you achieved. It was something you maintained, constantly, relentlessly, without pause. His influence extended far beyond the operating room, reaching into policy, education, and the global structure of healthcare itself, advising governments, helping design medical programs, and advocating for higher standards in both practice and training, because he understood something that many specialists don't: that innovation without structure doesn't scale. And if you want to change medicine, you don't just change techniques, you change the system that produces them. But perhaps the most unexpected and almost poetic moment in his entire life came when he found himself on the other side of everything he had built, not as the surgeon, but as the patient. Because even someone who spends a lifetime redesigning medicine isn't exempt from the realities of the human body. And in his later years, DeBakey developed a life-threatening condition involving his own aorta, the very structure he had spent decades studying, repairing, and revolutionizing treatment for. And suddenly, the man who had defined modern cardiovascular surgery was facing the exact kind of problem he had dedicated his life to solving. What followed was a situation that felt almost like a reflection of his entire career: complex, high-risk, and surrounded by difficult decisions, because the surgery required to save him was itself extremely dangerous, especially given his age. And initially, there was hesitation, not just from the medical team, but from DeBakey himself. Because he understood the risks better than anyone, he knew exactly what could go wrong, exactly how thin the margin for error was, and for a moment, it seemed possible that he might choose not to undergo the procedure at all, which would have been an ironic ending for someone who had spent his life refusing to accept limitations. But in the end, the decision was made to proceed, and the surgery was performed using techniques and approaches that had been shaped directly or indirectly by DeBakey's own work, which is where the story shifts from impressive to almost symbolic. Because this wasn't just a patient being treated, it was a man being saved by the very system he had helped create. The operation was successful, and DeBakey recovered, continuing to live and work for years afterward. And if that sounds like something written for dramatic effect, it's not. It's simply what happens when someone spends a lifetime pushing the boundaries of what medicine can do, and then, unexpectedly, becomes proof of those advancements. But even beyond this moment, his legacy had already been secured in ways that go far beyond any single achievement. Because the true measure of his impact isn't found in one invention or one procedure. It's found in the transformation of an entire field, in the shift from medicine as reactive care to medicine as engineered systems, in the idea that the human body, while incredibly complex, is not beyond understanding or improvement, and that problems once considered permanent can, with enough persistence and innovation, become solvable. Throughout his life, DeBakey trained thousands of surgeons, influenced countless others, and helped establish standards that continue to define modern practice. And perhaps more importantly, he demonstrated a mindset that has become essential to progress: the refusal to accept "that's just how it is" as a final answer. Because in his world, that phrase was less of a conclusion and more of a challenge. Even into his later years, well past the point where most would have retired, he remained active, engaged, and, by all accounts, still demanding, still precise, still unwilling to compromise on quality, which, depending on your perspective, is either exhausting or exactly what you want in someone responsible for shaping the future of medicine. And as his life eventually came to an end, what remained wasn't just a list of accomplishments, but a completely redefined landscape, a medical world that operates on principles he helped establish, where surgeons routinely perform procedures that would have been unthinkable before his time, where devices support life in ways that once belonged to imagination, and where the standard for what is possible has been permanently raised. And maybe that's the most remarkable part of this entire story. Not just that Michael DeBakey changed medicine, but that he changed how medicine thinks. Because once you adopt the belief that systems can always be improved, that limitations can be challenged, and that impossible is often just a temporary description, you don't just advance a field, you transform it. And that transformation doesn't end when one person's career does. It continues, evolving, expanding, and pushing forward in ways that reflect the mindset that started it all, which means that even now, long after his time in the operating room has ended, every successful surgery, every improved technique, Every life extended by innovation carries a trace of that same idea, that the human body is not a boundary, it's a system waiting to be understood and improved.